As former fire captain John Orr walked in to be sentenced today, looking at his face, there was no clue to the madness that would cause him to set fires all over California, killing 4 people in this 1984 fire at Ole's Home Center in South Pasadena. 2 store employees died in this blaze, along with 2-year-old Matthew Troidel and his 50-year-old maternal grandmother. Prosecutors claim the former arson investigator got sexual gratification out of setting fires. Today, Orr declined to address the court, and Judge Robert Perry sentenced him to 4 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole.
I find that 4 concurrent life without parole terms are appropriate for counts 1 through 4, and they are now imposed.
Hearing the sentence, Orr seemed passive, but relatives of people killed in fires he set wanted the death penalty, an eye for an eye.
He gets to see his grandson. He gets to just enjoy breathing and being alive. And that's more than our families are going to be able to do.
At the Glendale Fire Department, where John Orr worked, former colleagues said, "Good riddance to bad rubbish."
I think he's very sick. It's very disappointing to work with someone and think that they have the same motivations that you do and find that they don't.
Leaving court, John Orr will now spend the rest of his life in prison. He was also convicted on 20 counts of arson for setting the 1990 College Hills fire in Glendale. Doug Kriegel, Channel 4 News.
Welcome to the Scarlet Tavern. Grab a drink, take a seat, and let's begin. Tonight's episode, we continue our discussion on John Leonard Orr, the firefighter turned arsonist and killer. Does this spark your interest? This is a Scarlet Tavern. All right, and we are back with part 2. We would like to welcome my father, Aaron, who is our merchandising director for Dungeons and Magi, one of our founding members and board members. Also a law enforcement veteran. Did more law enforcement than Ben and I combined. So, I want to start off if you would tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your background.
I was originally going that branch and decided to just dive right into law enforcement. So I did 20 years in Florida with the sheriff's office down there. Started in corrections, like a lot of people do, to get my name out there and learn faces. Retired in 2008 and jumped into the nuclear side of things and went into nuclear security and nuclear protection. Did that for quite a while. Security jobs here and there, off and on. Extensive training in narcotics and investigations and all that good stuff.
So yeah, we're kind of adding to all of this, to everything that we talk about. He's going to go ahead and join us in part 2 of everything that we do in our second parts. We do record everything on one night. We just split it into 2 recordings, and by the time he gets off of work, he's able to join us in part 2. So we'll be jumping into part 2, and he's going to share a little bit more law enforcement knowledge from what we did. He and I both were volunteer firefighters for a time, even here in Kentucky. So in this particular instance, we are able to share a little bit on that as well. But yeah, so we are glad to have him for our second parts of all of our stuff. And I want to start off with an F, marry, kill.
Oh. For just Aaron or me too?
Both of you.
Oh, God.
F, marry, kill. Ed Kemper.
Oh.
Ed Gein. And Jim Jones.
Oh, God.
Oh, goodness.
This one from, please. Oh, God. This is...
Go ahead, Ben. F, marry, kill. Ed Kemper. Ed Gein. Jim Jones.
F, Ed Kemper. Kill Gein, Mary Jones.
Okay.
Gein is creepy. No.
Okay. What is yours?
Probably Mary Jones, because everybody was with Jones anyway. So why not? Just jump in the fray there. Man, probably was it Kemper and Gene, right?
Gein, yeah.
Gene. Oh yeah. Oh God. It's like the lesser of two evils. What do you do?
I mean, with Gein, at least he could make he can create interior decorations. Just got to give him a shovel and and a cemetery.
Well, that is true. That is true. So I may have to change that and say I would marry him, because then I would at least get the interior decorating taken care of. We wouldn't have to worry about new curtains all the time.
Yeah.
So, and then, oh goodness, probably M. Kemper, probably. Yeah. So that leaves Jones, right? Since I switched it. So there you go.
Okay. I would marry Ed Kemper, because all accounts were Ed Kemper was actually a nice person. He just had some mental problems.
I would say
So same thing as my ex-wife.
Dude, you're right. And all my ex-wives.
Exactly.
That's it. That's the direction I'm going. I'm already used to it.
So, and God, I hope she hears this. This is the mother of my child, but still.
Oh boy.
So, yes, I would marry Ed Kemper. I would F Jim Jones. Because everybody was doing it, why not?
Exactly.
Plus he was charismatic. And then I would kill Ed Gein, because I mean the man doesn't need to be effed. He makes lampshades out of women's vaginas. Let's be honest.
Interestingly enough, he's from the same area as Pam was from.
Yes, he is. We will touch on Ed Gein.
That's scary.
All right. So, if you want to just do a quick recap of everything we touched on in part 1, and then we'll move on to part 2.
Of course. So as we were talking about in part 1 about John Leonard Orr, his early life, born in Los Angeles, former Air Force firefighter stationed in Spain and Montana, voluntarily went to Montana. Caleb and I still haven't figured out why anybody would do that, but probably does confirm he was psychotic. Started off as his public service as attempting to join pretty much every law enforcement agency in Los Angeles, being rejected by the LAPD for being mentally unfit. Eventually, he did apply to the Los Angeles Fire Department, but during the fire academy, he was overweight, out of shape, and unable to complete the task or handle the education task, so he ended up being kicked out of that. He would eventually settle, which it was. He settled for the Glendale Fire Department, which at the time was the lowest paying fire department. While on his off time from the Glendale Fire Department, he'd work as store security for Sears and at 7-Eleven, and he would get very proficient at asset protection and security, and would start garnering the reputation at the time as a cop wannabe. Would hang out at all the drinking establishments for the cops, basically trying to measure up to actual police officers and failing miserably. Eventually, he would apply for and take a different position within the Glendale Police Department as the Hill Patrol, basically driving the 3-ton truck around with the portable hose and water tank, checking campsites and other fire places for fire inspections, and putting out small brush fires. This is where he would also start developing his pyro tendencies, really. Obviously he probably started off at a very young age but this is where he really came into his element. He would be also going to college for firefighting sciences, and also police sciences as well. Eventually, he would rise to the ranks of the Glendale Fire Department and become a captain and a lead fire investigator during the 80s. This is also where he would start setting multiple brush fires around the Southern and Central California region. Many of these were done as diversionary arsons in order to set something larger in the area. Eventually, one of these would be the I think it was pronounced, what did we call it? Olay's, O-L-E.
Olays, yeah.
Olay's hardware store, which would unfortunately lead to the tragic death of 4 people, including a 2-year-old boy and his grandmother. Interesting enough about this case, many arson investigators from Southern California were brought into the area, including John Orr. And most of them had concluded that this was an electrical fire. Not Johnny Boy. No, he was like, this is arson. Made a big stink about it, too. Nobody believed him, but he was convinced it was arson.
And,
how did he know this? Because he did it.
And one of his things, what's funny, and we were joking about this in part 1, is if you remember CSI Miami, the redhead, and I know you hate this guy.
David Caruso. I looked him up.
John Orr would do this. He would walk in with glasses on and walk in and go, the fire started there. And I told him, I said, it's just like CSI Miami, like, this sparks my interest.
And that would be his thing. Now, keep in mind, he didn't investigate all of his fires, but he did investigate some. He would go to fires, and it would just be, let's say, at a big campsite or like an RV campsite. Firefighters are canvassing the area, clearing the rubble or the rubbish, trying to find out anything. They'd be over there. He'd just pull up, look around, and he'd be like, and just where nobody would be over there. And somehow he's like, there it is. I found the point of origin.
But of course, I would be like I said the last one, I would be the greatest detective if I was solving all my own killings. I would be the world's greatest detective.
Oh, sure. 100%. What I find interesting with this is during this whole time, he had every opportunity to sway the investigations.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't. So looking at that, looking at his background, the fact that he wanted to be law enforcement, couldn't cut it. He wanted LAPD, couldn't cut it. Wanted the fire department, couldn't cut it. Settled for Glendale. It was an ego thing.
Mm-hmm.
The fire aspect, that was there for years. It's not something that you just wake up one day and go, oh, I'm going to start playing with fire. There's always been that fascination.
Oh yeah,
This was
absolutely.
just like you had said, the culminating factor, all the pieces were in place, everything was there. So then it becomes a, well, look at me, you know. I want you to know that I did this without 100% admitting that I did this.
Mm-hmm. And as we touched on episode 1, during an actual conference, during a conference in Bakersfield, California. Well, actually, it was in Fresno, but I guess Fresno and Bakersfield aren't that far apart from each other. I've never been to California, so I have no idea. Somebody in any listeners out
You
there in
are
California?
not missing anything because California's a shithole.
I normally would
California.
I would say something to disclaimer to people who live in California, but I have friends. I have
friends that live in California and they hate it.
Yeah, so
and I've been there a few times, and it sucks.
Yeah. Around the time that there was actually a conference and / convention for arson investigators for Central California, a series of arsons started breaking out, including a department store where somebody had actually used a incendiary device that was homemade with a combination of a lit cigarette, 3 matches, a rubber band wrapped around, and yellow legal writing pads. And this is what it was used. It was set in an artificial flower, and it would cause a fire, which caused damage. Luckily, nobody was hurt in this fire. But this is where their first real clue to this was. They found a fingerprint. Unfortunately, they could not actually determine who the fingerprint was. But this is also when the investigators started realizing this is possibly a arson investigator.
Well, and we talked about it the last one, and you became a cop in the early 90s. So this was 87. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in most states, even back then, they didn't have the ability to run fingerprints like we do now. Your comparison of fingerprints is literally looking at 2 fingerprints and going back and forth and trying to find the points of reference between the fingerprints.
Yeah, very accurate. During the late 87, I would have been junior in high school, getting ready to go into senior year. At that point, everything was geared towards law enforcement. I knew that that's what I was doing at 10. So, at that time, it was exactly that. The only one that had the ability to digitally scan was the FBI. And they basically kept it locked down because, well, they're the FBI. You know, we have the toys. We don't want you to have the toys, blah, blah, blah. And it was several occurrences like this that spurred a national cry throughout the law enforcement community that said, hey, we need a way to unify the fingerprint system and the ability to track throughout state to state to state. But what you would do is exactly what Caleb said. You would have somebody that had extensive training in fingerprint identification, and they would spend hours with these index cards. Looks like a 6x8 card, and they're taking their magnifying glass and going over the print and making notations, and you're spending hours and hours and hours. And then when you find what you think could be a catch, that gets sent to who? The FBI.
Well, and to add to that, so not only were they having to do that, but when this arson investigator made a short list, there was 10 people on that short list that he fingerprinted. So now he's having to do, you figure you spend 3-4 hours on one fingerprint, that's 40 hours spent. You're gonna miss something.
Oh yeah.
And especially if the system is already just inherently I don't want to say flawed. It's not, but it's not as efficient as we're used to.
Right.
Things get missed. And in this case, John Orr's fingerprint that they had on record compared to what they found on just a scrap of legal pad paper that was recovered from the scene just did not match his thing. So it was dropped. But as you said, the ego is feeding this. This is not the end of his thing. The end of this. And about in late 1990 and early 1991, another series of arson fires broke out in Southern California. This time it was around the metropolitan area of Los Angeles. As a result, now Los Angeles Police Department is being brought in, and a larger task force was formed, nicknamed the Pillow Pyro Task Force. This is in reference to the fact that
great anime name. Forget Fire Force. The Pillow Pyro Task Force.
This is in reference to the fact that John Orr would sometimes use pillows to start the fires as well. March 29th, 1991. Tom, I'm gonna butcher this name.
Campuzano.
Campuzano, yeah, thank you. What do I do without you, Caleb? Without to pronounce the words that I can't pronounce.
That's why I'm the boss.
Okay, speaking of feeding egos, of the Los Angeles Arson Task Force circulated a flyer at a meeting of the Fire Investigators Regional Strike Team first. And this was an organization formed by smaller cities in and around Los Angeles County to kind of like pool resources because they didn't have the staffing to have their own dedicated arson investigators. They actually were able to describe the modus operandi of the suspect, and this is when a lot of the players from Bakersfield and everybody are starting to come together, and they're starting to realize, okay, they're all comparing notes, and now they're starting to realize, yes, this is an arson investigator who's committing these crimes, and we believe he's from the Los Angeles area.
And I will just let everybody know, modus operandi is motives. That is the official term and coining for motives and methods.
The method of operation.
Mm-hmm. And as we'll see, John Orr's MO, his modus operandi, would basically he would start a fire, a smaller fire, but significant enough to draw the fire department away to, say, a brush fire. He would go to a campsite somewhere in the hills of Los Angeles, set a fire. LAFD would go and fight this fire. Then he would be free to set another fire at another building or another department store or wherever, and just start a bigger fire and just kind of watch his work. Let me see. I had lost my spot. So now, consequently, this is several years. This is a few years after they've already gotten the fingerprint. They've never lost the fingerprint, but Campuzano and some of his colleagues met with others, and they were actually able to re-examine the fingerprint from the '87 case in Bakersfield, and they were actually able to this time, due to advancements in fingerprint analysis, they were able at this point to determine that. John Orr's the fingerprint came from John Orr's left ring finger. So at this point, now they realize, okay, we have circumstantial evidence. A surveillance of several months is being put on John Orr to kind of track his move and see what he is doing. It almost got blown because at one point, John Orr found the tracking device in his vehicle. He found it, but he thought it was a bomb. So he actually raced to the Los Angeles Police Department's explosive range and called the police saying he had a bomb, and they had to intercept him. It's like, hey, it's a hoax. It was just a joke. All the while, they actually had a second device planted on his work vehicle. At that point, they're still following him, and then another arson breaks out in the Los Angeles area. But due to the tracking device, they're actually able to put him within the vicinity of the fire. Then they were able to actually get a federal grand jury to indict him, and they got a warrant to arrest him. When they arrested him, inside of his car, they found a bag full of matches, rubber bands, cigarettes, and a couple of packets of legal paper pads. All together. These were all like in his briefcase.
All recreational.
Yeah.
Everybody goes around with those in their vehicle. Not a big deal.
Yeah.
You know.
What I'd like to say is, from the law enforcement side, those things are everyday common items.
Correct.
However, the evidence of those being used to start the fire, that's when you start getting the ability to place those specific items. You already know that you have evidence that it's an arson investigator who was using those specific items. That's when you're able to put those two and two together. I could be driving around with those items and they could suspect, but they can't do anything because they have no evidence.
Right.
But along with the tracking device will also help, because most of the times that he was setting fires, he was in his work vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So they're able to use that and track that. And the man's not going to look for a tracking device on his work vehicle.
No.
It really was just pure.
And this is before, of course, they track all of those vehicles anyways.
Yeah, if John Orr today were around today doing what he did back in the 80s and 90s today, he probably wouldn't have gone past the first fire.
He would not. I mean, he barely lasted. He didn't last that long here. I mean, he lasted what?
Not even a decade. Not even a decade.
Yeah, he lasted 5-6 years, and which I will say he gained captain very quickly. Granted, this was a very poor department, but gaining captain in under 10 years is pretty good.
That's huge.
Exactly. Plus the fact he not only was he just a captain in the Glendale Fire Department, as I touched on a little bit. John Orr, despite his personality, he was not Mr. Congeniality. He had a certain contempt for authority. He had this all the way going back to his Air Force times, and it really wouldn't. Being rejected by what was at the time the most premier law enforcement agency outside of NYPD or the FBI in the world was definitely a huge rebuke to his ego. So it didn't really help his contempt of authorities. In this case, he became the authority. So he would actually go on to be a very leading figure in arson investigation. They actually kind of a little oopsie daisy when he was already convicted and sent off to prison. They forgot to scrub the training videos for California arson school, and they were still using his training videos with him starring in it.
This training video is hot.
I actually watched one of them. I actually watched some of them. I actually found before they used to be on YouTube. I don't know if they still are, but I think they used to be. I mean, you look at it at first. You look at it, it's really just boring stuff. It's like you look at this is this and this, and like this is mind-numbing stuff. But then you realize this guy is a serial arsonist, the most prolific in America. You're like, wow, yeah, he would know this stuff, wouldn't he?
What better teacher, right?
Exactly. It did kind of cause a little bit of a minor scandal because they realized it's like, did nobody think to scrub his name from all of our records? But one of the other damning things throughout his arrest, he was actually able to post bail, but he had to placed under electronic house arrest. One of the things that they would eventually, when they were searching his home for other evidence, they found a manuscript of a book, unpublished. It followed the protagonist. I don't quite remember the name of the person in it, of a arson investigator investigating a serial arsonist who he believes to be, drumroll, also an arson investigator. And as it would be pointed out at the trial, many of the personality
Aaron Stiles.
Aaron Stiles, yes, the main character Aaron Stiles would be investigating this other serial arsonist who was a some kind of sadomasochist sexual guy, on top of him setting fires in a way that, oh look, he also happens to use cigarettes, rubber bands, matches, and legal paper. He also has this. To put it simply, John Orr basically wrote himself in a book, committing his crimes. And as we would find out, the manuscript would include fires that were committed down to the letter. Now, the problem with this is for John, not for the prosecution, these were fires that John actually did not investigate. They were not in the Glendale Fire Department's jurisdiction. He was not consulted. John Orr would have no knowledge of it, and yet the setup of the fires would look like they came straight from the case file, of which John Orr had no access to. So how do he know about them? On top of that, the modus operandi of the fictional serial arsonist that he wrote about was the exact same to a letter, his modus operandi for the crimes that he committed. It didn't really take much people to take jurors to make the leap that John Orr just decided to confess to his crime and try to make some money off of it. His lawyers did try to suppress the evidence during the trial. They were, unfortunately, for him, these were clearly within the bounds, and they would end up not being prejudicial. Despite all the he and hawing and the appeals, John Orr was eventually convicted of these crimes, and eventually in 1998, I believe it was in the mid or late 90s, eventually they would relook at the 1984 Olay's hardware store arson, and again, John Orr's ego and hubris came back to bite him. The one investigation where everybody concluded it was an accident, but he thought it was arson, came back to bite him, and they reinvestigated and determined, oh no, looks like he did do that. So what was originally a 30-year sentence, which probably in all likelihood would have been appealed down or reduced down, given California's legal system. He was eventually convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Originally, they were going to pursue the death penalty, but he was sentenced to life in prison. The jury was split 8-4 in favor of the death penalty, but under the California Penal Code, it meant he was automatically given life sentences. And that is what then, after all appeals were denied and his family had cut him off, John Orr now is resting in the California Central Prison in Centralia. You cannot look him up. Apparently, there is a way under the California penal system. There's like on the computer, you can actually look up and see the status of an inmate in California. John Orr is actually not listed there. He is still alive. They believe he's under some kind of like protection so that somebody doesn't try to kill him, although I doubt anybody would want to kill an arsonist from the 90s.
So here's the thing that happens too that not a lot of people realize is when you are a type of first responder that has cases, whether it's civilian law enforcement, federal, military, or a arson investigator, with him getting in trouble and him doing all of this. This now causes every single case that he ever worked to be reopened and relooked at, which means they can declare mistrials on every single thing he did. Everybody that he put in jail will get subsequently released while their case is being reinvestigated. So all these real arsonists that he did catch, because he fucked up, they're all going to be freed. And that's one part that people don't really get.
Oh, 100%. And for all the little law legal beagles out there, would know that what Caleb's talking about is fruit of the poison tree. The assumption is the tree's poisoned, the fruit that's attached to it is more than likely poisoned as well. So, like Caleb explained, the ramifications are huge. Even though he may not have had a detrimental effect on the investigation or the arrest of that case, because he himself was a bad apple, you can't hold those others that he has been involved with accountable as bad apples as well. So, and we see that not just with this case, but numerous cases throughout law enforcement, some that I was privy to over the years, unfortunately. But so now, okay, we get Orr's arrested, but now the flip side of that coin is we have, for lack of an accurate number, hundreds of criminals that we have to now let go, that are free to do whatever and run amok.
I did try to look up any like aftermath of John Orr's case. So obviously John Orr, in terms of the killers and other serial killers that we have researched and we are planning to research, John Orr doesn't really blip on there. By all accounts, I don't even think John Orr qualifies as a serial killer, just by the standard definition.
No. So when we're talking about a serial killer, there are of course certain things that need to happen. 9 times out of 10 serial killers have a pattern, a type. And you are looking at, now there have been serial arsonists that were also serial killers as well. They use the fire as their weapon, but he was not. And as a point of fact, he did not intend to kill anybody when he set these fires. They just happened to be in there, could not get out. So, but no, he's not listed as a serial killer. There technically has to be at least 3 separate instances of a killing to list as, and they have to have a certain amount of time in between each one. With this 4, it would be closer to a mass killing than it would be just like the DC sniper. Mm-hmm. He technically was not a serial killer.
Correct. He was just a mass shooter.
He was a mass shooter, so it's kind of the same thing. Which we will touch on the DC sniper because that's a very, very interesting case.
I actually remember.
I remember the DC sniper. Very, very interesting case.
One of the things with John Orr, although he is not a serial killer, and the thing, he is considered one of the nation's most prolific. I can speak English, I swear.
Words.
Yeah, words. he is one of the most prolific serial arsonists by the FBI and ATF standards. He is the worst that our country has ever seen.
Oh yeah, I mean,
um,
there's a big difference between serial killer and serial arsonist, though. But it's you're in the same area where certain amount of fires have to be set at a certain amount of time, blah 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 blah.
Well, I always found it interesting as I was researching this. A lot of the times, as it was pointed out, a lot of arsons would occur when he was at conventions or conferences, like professional conferences for a thing. He'd be up in Fresno, like you said, Fresno. He's had attended a conference, and then all of a sudden, all these fires start breaking out in the area. It almost seemed like this was like a ego trip to him. Like you said, Aaron, the fire thing has always been there. He's probably always had a thing for fire. They made a thing in the audio clip that we played at the beginning. They made a thing about he got sexual gratification from it. I mean, maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
So I don't believe that.
I don't
when we look at other arsonists, serial arsonists, and we look at sexual gratification, typically what would happen is they set the fires and then they will wait and hide and watch the burn. They will watch the response. They will watch the aftermath. Where John Orr didn't do that. He set the fires and then left.
And since we're going down that road, through all the training that I had in this area, you talk about the sexual ties for those that are sexually aroused by fire. They will visibly masturbate in front of that fire because that arousal is so intense. So with Orr, that wasn't the case. I think it was 100% an ego thing. Look at me, look at me. I mean, he was a busy bee. 2,000 fires in a 7-year period. That's huge. That's a lot of fires.
And like you said, he did investigate some of those fires. Some of those things were his own things, and I maybe in his twisted, in his really sociopathic mind, because like you said, I don't think he probably didn't intend to kill people. I don't think he cared one way or the other. He's over the years he's been interviewed by people. Joseph Wamba, a very famous true crime author, one of my favorite true crime authors, interviewed him, and that's for the basis of the book that I have, Fire Lover King. He doesn't care. He did not care. He killed a 2-year-old boy. He could have cared less.
I don't think he's a sociopath. So here's the thing that people also have to understand. We hear two terms, psychopath and sociopath. Ben, do you know the difference between the two?
Well, just a very general, like a psychopath is somebody who's just, their mind is twisted and just, they have a mental illness and they can't differentiate between the reality and their own twisted fantasies. A sociopath is just somebody who is completely aware of his or her surroundings. They just simply do not care. They have no empathy, sympathy, or emotional anything to anybody.
Yeah. So the sociopath knows what they're doing is wrong. They just don't care. There is a part of their brain which they've intensely been studying since the 80s. Since we coined the term serial killer. But there's something in their brain that makes it where they can't feel emotions. They can't love. They can't do anything like that. So you have some people that are psychopaths, and they can still feel love and hatred and things like that. Then you have other people, like Ed Gein would be considered a psychopath. He did not know what he was doing was wrong. This is how he was growing up, and he showed love. He loved his mother so much so that he wore her skin.
And taxidermied her too.
Exactly. Where you have somebody like Ted Bundy, who, in my opinion, is a sociopath. In my opinion, he never loved his significant others. I think that was all a show. He never loved her daughter. I think it was all just, he was all about a show that he always put on a front. So in here, I don't think that he is either a sociopath or a psychopath. I think this was all ego. It was, so we see that he was working security, and he told everybody he found his cop sixth sense when he was doing security. Which we have to laugh at as former law enforcement.
Paul Blart.
Yeah.
Paul Blart.
He makes Paul Blart look like a real cop.
He actually looks like Paul Blart.
He does. He does.
If you look at a photo of John Orr, he has like the little mall cop stash.
Yeah.
And the little bald in there. He was kind of pudgy. I was like,
he had a mustache his whole law enforcement career.
Hey, in my defense, that was the thing then. If you were law enforcement or whatever, that was what you had. You had that mustache, and it was cool. And I may or may not have worn those shades. I can neither confirm nor deny such actions.
We need, Caleb, your mission is to find a picture of your dad is in the uniform.
There's one in the garage. I know exactly where.
Oh, Lord.
Hey, you better scan that and post that in Discord. So, I mean, now, Aaron,
And I'm pretty sure Amy would be, because I know she'll listen to this at some point, she'll be able to produce said photograph, I'm sure.
So. Aaron, when you worked at being a volunteer firefighter and a cop, did you guys ever have to like look into your like inward to find this stuff? Because it seemed to me back in the day, like in this time period, it seemed like firefighters, cops were like they had like the blinders on, and they just like John Orr is like he said, that was not a joke. He literally would show up to crime scenes and just find out what's going on. Like he just knew. People at first, like, oh my God, he's just a great investigator. Now we're looking at like.
Now I will say this, and I had this conversation with somebody before. Like, we'll take law enforcement because that's what I did the longest. I always said that there are two types of people: those that are born for law enforcement and those that want to be law enforcement. Does not mean that those that want to be and aren't born for it can't do it. It just means that they're going to have a harder time, okay? That being said, those that are born for it, I firmly believe there's an innate, inherent gift. You just have this instinct about what to do, where to go, what to look for. I did it quite extensively, and a good example, my father, when he was alive, used to come down to Florida to do ride-alongs. And I remember we were out together the one night, and I decided to play just outside the drug neighborhood. And we're sitting there on the side, kind of hidden, watching cars. And I'm letting traffic go by. And I'm like, no. And this car goes by, and I went, that's the car we want. Long story short, we give chase. They tried to run. We ended up catching them. We get them. We make the arrest. We find a significant amount of drugs in the car. Get talking to my father afterwards. He said, how did you know? 10, 15 cars went by us that you could have stopped, because he had that background, so he knows what we're looking for. He said, why did you choose that one? I said, Dad, I don't know.
You just knew. It's instinct.
I just knew that was the vehicle I wanted, and what I was after would be in that car. So in some cases, it is a gift. Now, in Orr's case, I do believe that gift does not allow you to just stand there and go, oh, it's going to be 300 yards that way, when all of the evidence is pointing the
Over
opposite
here.
way, you know? So
It's so a similar case it's not an arson, but it's an espionage case that I told Caleb we will be covering this. It may or may not be my third episode. Is Aldrich Ames was next to Robert Hansen, the most damaging mold the CIA ever had. Now Aldrich Ames had been passing information for money to the Russians for years.
Oh, mercy.
Aldrich Ames was literally showing up at Langley, at the office at Langley, and like a Rolls Royce or like a very expensive car for years.
Yeah.
It's like, and then they were like,
wow.
Shock, gasp, he was a spy. Wow. And I was like, here's a question. How did you not figure it out? It was the fact that he's owning a car. Oh God.
It was the thing, man. It was the thing.
I believe it. But it seemed, but like Aldrich Ames, it literally took 10 years for them to realize, hey, he's living behind his means. We should look at his records. Hey, he's getting a lot of money in his bank accounts every month that we can't trace. Hey, the Russians are getting access to information that only Ames has. It's like, I've been reading the book on it. It's like, wow.
How did you not know?
It's like, wow, you took a whole book to realize that we should have been like, hey, Captain Obvious, how did it not occur to you? In this case, John Orr is literally showing up to investigate. Now, obviously, he didn't investigate all of them, but he's literally showing up to cases. And like you said, the firefighters are clearing an area that's burning over here, and he goes over here. He's like, I found it. It's like, how? I can't believe somebody didn't think. How?
I think that is indicative of the difference in investigation and thinking then as compared to now. Training has come so far, personal experiences of the officers, all that kind of thing. You know, and at that time, having a serial arsonist was a relatively new thing. You know, there was not a ton of them out there.
From what I've understood, before the typical arsonist is one of two guys. He was either like a paid criminal.
Mm-hmm.
You give him a couple of 50s, he burns down your warehouse for the insurance money.
Right.
The other was like a dysfunctional psycho who's foaming at the mouth every time you light a match. He can't, he's more likely to set a dumpster on fire than an elaborate thing that John Orr did. So that probably also played a factor. Everybody was looking for these two types, and they're like, we got a thinky man's arsonist now.
Yeah.
Definitely. Caleb, how are we doing for time?
So one thing I want to put into there is you also back then you didn't have many, like none of your arsonists were firefighters. Not many of your killers were cops. So there was this level of trust back then that there isn't now. We're made to be a little more suspicious now. Again, we're trained completely different now than, and I mean, I stopped being a cop in 2020, right before COVID hit, and just the difference of training between 2020 and 2023 is drastically different. Obviously, there's a lot to do with the civil stuff and stuff like that, but that's the other thing is we're seeing this from our point of view now in the 2020s, where we're like, oh yeah, I mean, we can see that a mile away, but we also are trained to think that way now, where in the 80s and 90s, they weren't trained to think that way. You weren't going to come out and go, oh, I bet you this is a firefighter. Because what good firefighter would set a fire? Your job is to put it out. What good cop would go murder somebody? Your job is to protect those people. So that definitely played a factor. But yeah, so John Orr, this was a short one, but a good one. And so two short two-parters. But next week we will be getting away from death a little bit and get into some stuff that we can make fun of a little bit. And kind of lighten the mood before we get into we are going to get into some heavy stuff here soon. But Ben will be doing a more lighthearted one next week.
It's lighthearted.
Yeah. So
I get to make fun of some people that I've always really liked to make fun of.
Yeah. They're idiots.
They really are.
So, with that being said, once again, we want to thank my dad, Aaron, for joining us for part 2. You guys will continue to see/hear him in part 2 of each of our episodes. So, if you guys have any suggestions on anything we should touch, we have a list. We're more than happy to add to it. If you guys would like to see us do Patreon episodes that are Patreon exclusive, let us know. Dungeons & Magi has a Patreon. We will start adding Patreon episodes to the Dungeons & Magi Patreon. And we'll do Patreon exclusive episodes where we kind of dig a little bit deeper into some stuff. But if you guys have any of that, let us know. Reach out. Just as a reminder, Dungeons & Magi, Scarlet Tavern is a child of Dungeons & Magi. In Dungeons & Magi, we are a group of friends who decided to take our love for D&D and turn it into a business and bring our love for D&D to you guys. We have currently stopped the podcast part of that. We will pick that back up in campaign 2 next year. But you can find us live every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch and YouTube. And you can find the replays on our YouTube, Twitch as well, if you are subbed. If you would feel so inclined to sub, we would love for you to sub to us. And we do giveaways all the time. If you're interested in D&D and you're not sure about it, we're a really good show to watch because I break down why I do specific things and why this works this way. So please give us a listen, give us a like, and yeah. So. And if you guys ever want us to do a live stream of this, let us know, and we'll do a live stream of the talk show. But with that, I want to thank everybody for visiting the Scarlet Tavern. Remember to turn in your glasses, push in your seat, and always tip the bard. Good night, everybody.
Good night.